Hey everybody, welcome to episode 12 of The Bitter Pill, the show where we discuss bitter pills of truth that many people don't want to hear, don't want to swallow, and the corporate media doesn't want us to know exist. So today's the day of the New Hampshire primary. I had really hoped to get this video out before then, but didn't work out. I got a sick rabbit here that I'm taking care of and other stuff going on. So anyway, I did what I could. And for the last few episodes, I've been comparing the policies and views of Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, the two most progressive candidates that are currently running for the Democratic presidential nomination. So in this final episode of that series, I'll finish my comparison of their stands and discuss my overall views of them and what their candidacies mean for the movement for social justice in this country and around the world. Now, usually I go through a bunch of links to videos and tweets and articles and so forth. I don't have time for that today because I have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm just going to talk. Um, and just to kind of summarize what I've discussed in previous episodes, first of all, I think that overall the movement for peace and social justice in this country has benefited from uh, both candidates' presidents in the race. And I think that's the case because primarily they're both putting important issues on the table nationally. So even if they don't win, they're both making important contributions to the political conversation about social justices and needed social reforms in this country. And Bernie does so principally through his class-conscious approach to domestic politics, and Tulsi principally through her emphasis on the staggering financial and human costs of U.S. military interventions abroad. Although, as we've discussed in previous episodes, uh, with some shortcomings, particularly of Bernie on foreign policy, both candidates overall have a progressive program and a strong message. One important issue that I have yet to discuss is the issue of civil liberties and the related issue of freedom of the press. And in a nutshell, Tulsi wins the comparison on these issues hands down. First of all, she's the only member of Congress and the only current presidential candidate to speak out against the arrest of Julian Assange the day that it happened, April 11th of last year, stating, "The arrest of Julian Assange is meant to send a message to all Americans and journalists. Be quiet, behave, toe the line, or you will pay the price." Bernie remained completely silent on this for more than a month and a half, when finally he issued an oblique statement that stated that no journalist should be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, but seemed to deliberately avoid mentioning Julian Assange by name, which he still hasn't done. And hasn't ever really discussed in any detail the horrible injustices of his persecution, or just how severe the threat to freedom of the press a prosecution like this is, if it's, it already is. So, asked specifically by a reporter back in October if he supported Julian Assange or would pardon him or commute his sentence if he received one, Bernie refused to answer the question, stating, well, it would take too long to answer it when a simple yes would have sufficed. But Tulsi has stated that if she were president, she would immediately pardon Julian Assange, as well as whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. Tulsi also introduced a bill last fall to restore the Fairness Doctrine, H.R. 4401. Now, the Fairness Doctrine was a law that was on the books until 1987 that mandated that television and radio broadcasters, quote, afford reasonable opportunity for the discussion of conflicting views on issues of public importance. Unfortunately, Tulsi's bill to reintroduce the Fairness Doctrine so far doesn't have any co-sponsors. Both Tulsi and Bernie have been outspoken critics of the corporate media, and not surprisingly, Bernie has slammed the corporate media for its scanty coverage of economic inequality in America. Tulsi, for her part, has slammed the profit-driven nature of the corporate media, its utter failure to cover issues of war and peace in any sort of accurate or detailed fashion, and their biased coverage of the presidential elections. Um, and she encourages the growing trend of Americans to tune out the corporate media and increasingly tune in to alternative media outlets such as the proliferation of progressive YouTube shows, many of which she has appeared on. Tulsi actually wrote the foreword to a book by two up-and-coming progressive populist YouTubers. Well, one of them to maybe not that progressive, but populist anyway. Crystal Ball and Sagar Enjeti, who left jobs in the corporate media to start their own show called Rising on the Hill Network. So Tulsi wrote a foreword to their recent book, which is already high up on the Amazon bestseller list, even though it just came out. Recently, Tulsi's campaign released an extensive report on media bias in coverage of the 2020 presidential election that was centered around a Northwestern University study comparing coverage of herself and Pete Buttigieg in the corporate media. And certainly I will put a link to that document as well as various other things I'm talking about in the description of this video. Tulsi's also been a very outspoken critic of the new Cold War, with its demonization of Russia and the tarring of establishment critics, including herself, as, quote, Russian assets. And she's spoken out on the House floor. I'll put a link to that video as well in the description. Basically, calling out Congress for its obsessive focus on Russia and in terms of interfering in American politics, supposedly, and really neglect of any discussion of what other countries are doing, such as Israel or Saudi Arabia and so forth. And Tulsi has recently, after repeatedly asking Hillary Clinton to retract her statement smearing Tulsi as a Russian asset who was being groomed by the Republicans or Russians. It's not clear which to run as a third-party candidate. So she asked for a retraction. She didn't get it after several months, so now she is suing Hillary Clinton for $50 million. Hillary being kind of the linchpin of the smear campaign against Tulsi, claiming that she, like other people are accused of, is somehow a Russian asset because she is critical of the establishment and the war machine. Unfortunately, Bernie, on the other hand, has been a prolific purveyor of the neo-McCarthyist Russiagate narrative, as I think I've discussed before, but I'll put links below. In fact, until the Mueller report made apparent that it wasn't true, the notion that Donald Trump was in cahoots with Russia in rigging the 2016 election featured prominently in Bernie's discourse. So I hope that anyone watching this video who supports Bernie is willing to speak up and say, hey, Bernie, McCarthyism is not okay. It's very politically damaging in all kinds of ways. Tulsi has also been an outspoken opponent of the increased spying on Americans and general decline in civil liberties protections that has taken place since 9/11, including the passing of the Patriot Act and renewal of it. Bernie also has a fairly good record on civil liberties, but it just hasn't been as much of a priority for him as for Tulsi. Criminal justice reform has been a priority for both candidates. Both of them oppose the death penalty, support the abolition of private prisons, abolition of cash bail, and sentencing reform, as well as alternatives to incarceration that would substantially reduce the prison population, such as not throwing nonviolent offenders in prison at the drop of a hat. Both of them support the legalization of marijuana, which is another big one. But Tulsi goes one step further, supporting the legalization of all drugs, following the route, actually a very successful route of Portugal in this regard. Both candidates are also strong on promoting election integrity and fairness. They both advocate overturning the Citizens United decision and getting corporate money out of politics by banning corporate PACs and super PACs and providing increased public financing for elections. Both of them also support ending gerrymandering and voter suppression and otherwise protecting voter rights. They both also advocate automatic or same-day voter registration, making Election Day a federal holiday, and very importantly, ranked choice voting, which if we had that at the moment, there wouldn't be all these pressures being exerted on candidates that are not near the top of the polls, like Tulsi, for example, to drop out of the race. So we really, really need that for both minor candidates in the, or candidates that aren't doing as well in the Democratic primaries or Republican primaries, and third-party candidates. Both candidates advocate statehood for D.C. so that residents there can have representation in Congress. Both recognize the unfairness of the current electoral college system, but they have different approaches to addressing the issue, with Bernie advocating abolishing the electoral college and Tulsi opting for a proportional allocation of electors in proportion to the popular vote. Tulsi has also introduced the Securing America's Elections Act, which is a bill that calls for voters to have a verified paper backup of their votes that they cast in locales that use voting machines, or simply paper ballots in really most locations. In addition, for those locations that do use voting machines, her bill would mandate that the software used in those machines be open source so that, for example, a private corporation can't hide code that rigs the election. Finally, Tulsi advocates statehood for Puerto Rico, enabling citizens there to have congressional representation and the right to vote for president. It's really kind of bizarre and ridiculous that even though people in Puerto Rico and Samoa and other U.S. territories are considered to be full American citizens, as long as they live in those places, they don't have the right to vote in federal elections other than in presidential primaries. It's absurd. Anyway, in short, as I said at the beginning, these are the two most progressive candidates still in the race. I've talked about some of these issues where they both are decent today, and I've talked about many others in the past where they take very progressive positions. And in fact, although I wouldn't put them on the same level politically as Green Party candidates like Jill Stein or Ralph Nader, arguably they are, along with Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel, the most progressive Democratic candidates for president that I can recall there being in my lifetime. And I'm an old fart. I'm 58 years old, so I've seen a lot of Democratic candidates come and go. Really, I think that Tulsi and Bernie and arguably Mike Gravel and Dennis Kucinich are the most progressive candidates that the Democrats have run in many decades. And even Tulsi has been more successful than the other two. Bernie, obviously, extremely successful. So I think they're having an impact. And Both of them also seem to understand that just electing Democrats, even left-leaning Democrats such as themselves, is not by itself going to change the country. Bernie, in particular, has made this a point of emphasis, as his campaign slogan, "Not me, us," is meant to suggest. Um, in a speech during the 2016 campaign, Bernie elaborated on this a little bit, eloquently making clear the importance of social movements for social change. He said, "This is not about Bernie Sanders. You can have the best president in the history of the world, but that person will not be able to address the problems that we face unless there is a mass movement, a political revolution in this country. Right now, the only pieces of legislation that get to the floor of the House and Senate are sanctioned by big money, Wall Street, and pharmaceutical companies. The only way we win and transform America is when millions of people stand up, as you're doing today, and say, enough is enough." So I really got to give Bernie credit there. That's a pretty strong statement about the power of social movements and their necessity that electoral politics by itself can't change things. And Tulsi as well has talked about the importance of there being citizens movements demanding change to actually bringing change about. But one thing I think both candidates are missing is this: you can't have a revolution in a counter-revolutionary party. Not only are social movements necessary to social change, but generally speaking, they effect change in spite of the Democratic Party, which time and time again has proven to be an obstacle to social movements. Dragged kicking and screaming by the labor movement of the 30s and the civil rights and anti-war and other movements of the 50s through the 70s, um, but never really serving as a reliable ally. Lance Selfa talks about that in his book. I think it's called "The Democrats: A History," and Howard Zinn, in his book "A People's History of the United States," also documents how time and time again the Democratic Party has stabbed social movements in the back. Bernie, in fact, has even though he's been a nominal independent forever, except when he runs for president, uh, he's de facto a member of the Democratic Party and very involved in the Democratic Party. He's actually served as the outreach chairman for the Democratic Party for the last few years. He caucuses with the Democrats. And of course, in 2016, even though Hillary Clinton and her campaign and the DNC stabbed Bernie in the back, arguably stole the Democratic presidential nomination from him, nonetheless, he campaigned quite doggedly for Hillary Clinton. I think it was something like 40 campaign appearances he made as a Hillary Clinton surrogate in the 2016 general election. Um, and Tulsi's been a lifelong or adult lifelong Democrat, but uh, to her credit, she hasn't dissed third-party campaigns or third parties, and she actually didn't actively campaign for Hillary Clinton in 2016, even though she said she was voting for Hillary and was hoping that she won. Bernie, in contrast, has kind of trashed third-party candidates such as Ralph Nader. In 2004, he said, "Not only am I going to vote for John Kerry, I'm going to run around this country and do everything I can to dissuade people from voting for Ralph Nader. I'm going to do everything I can while I have differences with John Kerry to make sure that he is elected." Kerry, of course, was a supporter of the Iraq War that was going on at the time, whereas Bernie has presented himself as a staunch opponent of it. As I said, Tulsi is more open to the idea of third parties than Bernie is, even though she's been a lifelong Democrat and is committed to sticking with the Democrats for the time being. She's not going to run as a third-party candidate, contrary to popular belief, as she's said a million times. Um, and like Bernie, she's very committed to trying to reform the Democratic Party, um, which is an effort that, based on my experience of several decades now as a political activist and my reading of history, I think that effort to reform the Democratic Party is doomed to fail. And I also have to say that both of these candidates, both Bernie and Tulsi, fall short of my ideals in terms of their political outlook in some other ways. I already mentioned in a previous video my disagreements with their take on Israel and Palestine, that they're just not quite there yet in terms of their understanding of the situation, perhaps, and their recognition of how much political pressure on Israel it will take to bring about justice for the Palestinian people. Now, I don't really agree with those who call them Zionists or say they're fervently pro-Israel, because a look at their rhetoric and record in the last few years suggests they're not. But nonetheless, you know, uh, there needs to be a lot more pressure put on Israel in order to, from its main backer, the United States, in order for uh, justice to come to the Palestinian people, and Bernie and Tulsi need to recognize that. And finally, the bottom line on both of their politics is that they're both liberal or social democratic, whatever label you want to stick on them, reformers. Now, to their credit, they definitely support some very major reforms to capitalist governance in the United States, such as universal health care and a Green New Deal like piece of legislation to transform the nation's energy economy, and various other reforms, cutting the military budget, etc. But they don't really support socialism, even though Bernie calls himself a, quote, democratic socialist. What they support is reforming capitalism so that it will serve the needs of working people better. Now, that's fine as far as it goes. I think that if there's a stronger enough social movement, some significant reforms can come about, because obviously they have in other countries. Almost every other country has universal health care. No other country spends absurd amounts of their resources on military as the United States does, and so forth. But for a socialist like me, that's enough, not enough, for reasons that I'll get into in detail in some other video. However, as I said earlier, I think that the movement for peace and social justice in this country has benefited from their presence in the presidential race. Modest as the support for Tulsi Gabbard's campaign has been thus far, her message of opposing regime change wars, turning swords into plowshares, cutting the military budget, and using the resources freed up to uh, make major repairs and upgrading to infrastructure, and bring about major social reforms, such as a comprehensive climate change program, and um, free college, and so on and so forth. So, if the reform she advocates were pushed through, it would certainly make the U.S. less of an imperialist evildoer around the world, and create a more tolerable existence for the American people. And she's reached quite a few people with this message, even though, as I mentioned earlier, it's well documented that there's been a media blackout, mainstream media anyway, and very conservative smear campaign against her. Nonetheless, she's used alternative media, social media, and just various clever tactics to get her name out there, um, as well as appearing in some of the Democratic debates. So her message has reached a lot of people. So as a result, arguably, she may well have helped in revitalizing the peace movement, and hopefully will continue to do so. And she's a strong fighter for environmental sanity and civil liberties as well. In all those respects, except arguably environmental issues, although Bernie is a bit late to the game as far as that goes in terms of introducing climate change legislation. Um, but generally speaking, Tulsi is uh, better on these things than Bernie. But on the other hand, for his part, despite his major shortcomings in foreign policy, Bernie Sanders has built a populist campaign with more mass appeal than perhaps any Democratic candidacy in American history. He's broken records in terms of the number of donors, particularly small donors, and the number of campaign volunteers. And he's perhaps the most popular and best known politician in the country. Well, there's no perhaps about most popular. He is at this point, I think. That doesn't necessarily mean that the DNC won't be able to cheat him out of the nomination. There's a pretty good chance that they will be able to pull that off, and they'll certainly try to. That also doesn't mean that should he be the nominee, make it through the general election, and become president, that the reforms that he promotes are going to be anywhere close to becoming a reality anytime in the very near future, just by virtue of the fact of him being elected, even if he gets a majority in both houses of Congress. And he said that himself. Um, we have to have powerful social movements to affect social change. That's all there is to it. Nonetheless, there's at least a possibility that this movement that he has done a lot to build, uh, and that has built him as well, will break free the bonds of the Democratic Party, particularly as outrage increases over the never-ending attempts to screw him over and screw his supporters over by the ruling class in this country. However, I've got to say, in some ways, Bernie Sanders is his own worst enemy, and even at times undermines the movement that's behind him. He doesn't do a very good job a lot of the time of defending himself against the frequent and varied attacks on him, and he even throws his supporters under the bus at times. He threw filmmaker Matt Orfalea under the bus, Orfalea having done a brilliant examination of media bias against him, and then being subsequently smeared, just like Bernie is, by that media. And Bernie was like, oh, he's a hot potato. We can't touch him. We're not going to hire you for our campaign, even though you did a great video promoting my campaign. Bernie also threw Cenk Uygur under the bus when Cenk endorsed him, and he was likewise smeared by the media. They did stand up a little better for Joe Rogan when he said some complimentary things about Bernie and said he would likely vote for him, and then he was smeared by the media. And at times he's defended Tulsi, probably his most reliable ally, who's stood by him not only throughout 2016, but he he did stand up for when Hillary Clinton attacked her as a Russian asset and so forth. He basically said that was preposterous. But he's just kind of stood by and not said anything while some of his own campaign surrogates, such as Linda Sarsour and John Cusack, have viciously attacked Tulsi Gabbard. He's also, as I mentioned previously, pushed Russiagate propaganda, pushed propaganda regarding the Venezuelan government, and he's been fully on board with the impeachment fiasco, which I covered in a couple of previous videos. And he's far more willing to criticize Donald Trump and Republicans than he is to criticize members of his own party, whereas Tulsi is equally willing to criticize dishonesty and corruption and warmongering and so forth, whichever party it's in. Who can forget back in the 2016 election when Bernie said, who cares about your damn emails, referring to Hillary Clinton's shenanigans with using a private computer in her basement to handle classified information. And of course, we know about all the rest of her corruption. Bernie wasn't hard enough on her. Tulsi, on the other hand, has the courage to confront the establishment in spades. She's been the most outspoken defender of Julian Assange of any prominent American politician. She took a huge political risk when she resigned from the vice chairmanship of the DNC in 2016 and called out the DNC's election rigging and, of course, endorsed and campaigned for Bernie Sanders. And that was the beginning, well, not literally the beginning, but the beginning in a major way of the smear campaigns against her by the political establishment that continue to this day, and in fact have reached unprecedented levels during the past year or so that she's been running for president. She went out on a limb again when she and Dennis Kucinich in 2017 went on a fact-finding and peacemaking mission to Syria. While there, they met with hundreds of Syrians, including, quite unexpectedly, that wasn't on their itinerary, meeting with Bashar al-Assad when he asked them to. And for that meeting, she's been smeared relentlessly, not necessarily so much because of the meeting itself, because many other American politicians have met with Bashar al-Assad, but because she's been such a staunch opponent of U.S. policy in Syria and so much else about the U.S. War machine. And so she's been attacked relentlessly as a so-called Assad apologist, even though she's called Assad a dictator and so forth, ever since then. In 2017 and 2018, Tulsi was among the only prominent politicians to criticize Donald Trump's attack on Syria, whereas the vast majority of her fellow Democrats were applauding those attacks or staying silent, as Bernie, if I recall correctly, did. And there wasn't much media fanfare about it, hardly any reporting of it at all, actually, but just this past fall, WikiLeaks released documents from whistleblowers within the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, indicating that they'd sort of made up a just so story about the alleged chemical attacks, alleged to have been perpetrated by the Syrian government in 2018. And these documents from the whistleblowers really kind of vindicated her position, showing that there was very little evidence that the Syrian government had perpetrated any sort of chemical attack in 2018, and the evidence has been shaky about 2017 as well, and Tulsi's been willing to take a stand on both of those incidents and say, hey, where's the evidence of this? If you bring forward evidence, okay, fine, we'll prosecute Assad in The Hague or whatever, but you got to have evidence first. You can't just go bomb people without evidence that they did anything. Tulsi has also introduced congressional resolutions calling for U.S. troops to be withdrawn from Syria and calling out the illegality of U.S. policy in Syria in all sorts of ways. She's opposed the sanctions there. She was a lone voice against the House Democrats' doomed and flimsy impeachment case, being the only person to vote present who took any sort of serious oppositional position to Trump, and was the only one to promote the idea of censuring Trump for his other far more provable and serious criminal acts, violations of the Constitution, which her colleagues have basically been unwilling to call him out for. She's relentlessly attacked the corruption of both major parties and called out the bias and dishonesty of the corporate media and other wings of the political establishment. Recently, her campaign website released a report on media bias in coverage of the 2000 of this current presidential election, centered on a Northwestern University study comparing media coverage of herself versus the current media darling Pete Buttigieg, and also reporting a number of other informative statistics about coverage of the election. So I'll put a link to that in the description. Tulsi also sued Google for shutting down her campaign's ad account during a time of maximal publicity after the second, I believe, debate. And recently, as I said before, she's sued Hillary Clinton for slandering her by trying to claim that she's a Russian asset. Recently, she also called out the corruption of the Iowa caucus and called for Tom Perez's resignation over that issue. So, it's because of her courage and honesty in speaking truth to power that I'm planning to vote for when the Indiana primary finally rolls around in a couple of months. And I see her campaign as a unique sort of challenge to the political establishment. And judging from the ferocity of the smear campaign against her, perhaps exceeding even that against Ralph Nader during and after the 2000 election, the political establishment agrees with me about the significance of her challenge to the political establishment. All that said, there must be a challenge on a much larger scale than either of these political campaigns that takes place outside of the confines of the Democratic Party. We got to get our yellow vests on, so to speak, if we're going to progress toward significant social reforms, let alone toward socialism. We need the social movements of the 60s and then some, a lot more than that. We need a real third party that is fully independent of the Democratic and Republican parties and their established backers, and that has the power to succeed on a national scale. It's hard to think of a country in the world that has achieved major social reforms that hasn't had a political party that is completely independent of whatever the political establishment in that country is. It's impossible to think of one. But maybe that can't happen until large numbers of people try, as Tulsi is doing and Bernie is doing, and fail to reform the Democratic Party. Maybe the tens of millions of people supporting reformist campaigns within the Democratic Party, such as Tulsi's or Bernie's, will have to hit the brick wall of their limitations and suffer mass delusionment, anger, and frustration before we'll see a sizable chunk of people previously believing in Bernie as our savior or whatever to recognize how rigged the game really is and get out in the streets and rebel. We will see what happens. Okay, that's all for this episode of The Bitter Pill. I will see you next time.